Welcome to our YouTube channel, where we delve into the complexities of African heritage and its impact on African American identity. Today, we're exploring the loss of African traditions among African Americans and the factors contributing to this cultural disconnect. If you find this content thought-provoking, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more insightful discussions. In this segment, we'll examine the historical trauma of the transatlantic slave trade and its lasting impact on African American cultural identity. Enslaved Africans endured unimaginable trauma, including forced displacement from their homeland, family separation, and the suppression of their cultural practices by slave owners. Slave owners sought to strip enslaved Africans of their cultural identity, forbidding them from practicing their native languages, religions, and traditions. This cultural erasure created a disconnect from their African heritage that persists to this day. The transatlantic slave trade shattered African family structures and kinship networks, leading to a loss of intergenerational transmission of cultural knowledge and traditions. Enslaved Africans were often coerced into adopting European customs and values, further eroding their connection to their African roots in favor of assimilation into white-dominated society. Now, let's explore the challenges faced by African Americans in preserving their cultural heritage following emancipation. The journey of African Americans in the United States has been marked by a series of profound and often painful transformations. From the moment of emancipation, African Americans have had to navigate a complex landscape of social, economic, and political challenges, all of which have had a significant impact on their ability to preserve their cultural heritage. The end of slavery was a monumental achievement, but it was also the beginning of a new set of struggles. Freed from the bonds of slavery, African Americans were thrust into a society that was still deeply entrenched in racial prejudice and discrimination. This new reality presented a host of obstacles to the preservation of their cultural heritage. During the Jim Crow era, African Americans were relegated to segregated communities with limited access to educational and cultural resources. These communities, often located in the most impoverished areas, were systematically deprived of the resources necessary to sustain and nurture their cultural traditions. Schools for African American children were underfunded and overcrowded, with curricula that often ignored or misrepresented African American history and culture. Libraries, museums, and other cultural institutions were either inaccessible or severely limited in their offerings. This lack of access to cultural resources made it incredibly difficult for African Americans to preserve their heritage and pass it on to future generations. This isolation hindered efforts to preserve and pass down African traditions. In these segregated communities, African Americans were often cut off from the broader cultural and intellectual currents of the time. This isolation not only limited their ability to engage with and contribute to the wider cultural landscape, but also made it more difficult to maintain and transmit their own cultural practices. Traditional African art forms, music, dance, and oral histories were at risk of being lost as the pressures of daily survival took precedence over cultural preservation. The physical and social isolation of these communities created an environment in which cultural heritage was constantly under threat. Segregation policies and forced cultural suppression and assimilation, as African Americans were pressured to conform to white societal norms and values to survive in a hostile environment. The legal and social structures of segregation were designed to enforce a strict racial hierarchy, with African Americans at the bottom. This system of oppression sought to erase African American cultural identity and replace it with a version of culture that was acceptable to the dominant white society. African Americans were often forced to adopt the language, dress, and customs of white Americans in order to gain access to employment, education, and other opportunities. This pressure to assimilate had a profound impact on the preservation of African American cultural heritage, as many individuals felt compelled to abandon their traditions in order to survive. The Great Migration saw millions of African Americans leave the rural South for urban centers in the North, seeking economic opportunities and fleeing racial oppression. This mass movement, which took place over several decades, was one of the largest internal migrations in American history. African Americans left behind the familiar but oppressive environment of the rural South in search of better lives in the cities of the North. This migration was driven by a combination of push and pull factors. The push of racial violence, economic exploitation, and political disenfranchisement in the South, and the pull of industrial jobs, greater political freedom, and the promise of a better future in the North. However, the move to urban centers brought its own set of challenges for the preservation of African American cultural heritage. This mass movement disrupted traditional community structures and further diluted African cultural practices. In the rural South, African American communities had developed strong social networks and cultural traditions that were rooted in their shared experiences of slavery and resistance. These communities provided a sense of identity and belonging, as well as a framework for the preservation and transmission of cultural heritage. However, the move to urban centers often meant leaving behind these close-knit communities and the cultural practices that had sustained them. In the cities, African Americans faced new forms of segregation and discrimination, as well as the challenges of adapting to a rapidly changing urban environment. The pressures of urban life, combined with the need to navigate a predominantly white society, made it difficult to maintain traditional cultural practices. In urban areas, African Americans faced pressures to assimilate into mainstream American culture, leading to the adoption of westernized lifestyles and values at the expense of their African heritage. The urban environment presented both opportunities and challenges for African Americans. On the one hand, cities offered greater economic opportunities, access to education, and the chance to participate in a more diverse and dynamic cultural landscape. On the other hand, the pressures to conform to the dominant culture were intense. African Americans were often expected to adopt the language, dress, and customs of white Americans in order to succeed in the urban environment. This pressure to assimilate was reinforced by the media, educational institutions, and other cultural forces, which often portrayed African American culture as inferior or undesirable. As a result, many African Americans felt compelled to abandon their cultural traditions in order to fit in and succeed in the urban environment. This process of assimilation had a profound impact on the preservation of African American cultural heritage as traditional practices and values were often lost or diluted in the process. The fragmentation of African American families and kinship networks further complicated efforts to preserve cultural heritage. According to a study by the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the disruption of family structures due to economic pressures, migration, and systemic racism weakened the transmission of cultural practices and values. Kinship networks, which had historically played a crucial role in maintaining cultural continuity, were often strained or broken, making it even more challenging to sustain and pass down cultural traditions. This fragmentation had a lasting impact on the ability of African Americans to preserve their cultural heritage in the face of ongoing adversity. Despite these challenges, African Americans have shown remarkable resilience in reclaiming and preserving their cultural heritage. Community efforts, such as cultural festivals, educational programs, and the establishment of cultural institutions, have played a crucial role in this process. These initiatives have helped to revive traditional practices, celebrate African American history, and pass on cultural knowledge to future generations. The resilience and determination of African American communities in the face of adversity is a testament to the enduring strength of their cultural heritage. Finally, let's examine the legacy of intergenerational trauma and the ongoing efforts to reclaim African traditions among African Americans. Intergenerational trauma. The trauma of slavery and its aftermath has been passed down through generations, manifesting in psychological and emotional scars that continue to affect African American communities today. Cultural amnesia. Intergenerational trauma has contributed to a sense of cultural amnesia among African Americans, with many feeling disconnected from their African roots and lacking a sense of belonging and identity. Rediscovering roots. Despite these challenges, many African Americans are actively reclaiming their African heritage, seeking to reconnect with their ancestral traditions through cultural practices, language, music, and spirituality. Resilience and strength. The resilience and strength of African American communities are evident in their efforts to reclaim and celebrate their cultural identity, forging a path towards healing and empowerment. In conclusion, the loss of African traditions among African Americans is a complex legacy of historical trauma, forced assimilation, and systemic oppression. However, it is also a story of resilience, as African Americans continue to reclaim and celebrate their cultural heritage despite centuries of adversity. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the complexities of African American cultural identity. If you found this content enlightening, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation and honor the rich cultural legacy of African Americans.